John, welcome back.
Thanks so much, Brandon. It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, I really just have one question for you. What is the BSL token used for, and how does it fit into the broader bank social strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go into a little bit of a deep dive on the BankSocial token. So we did a Spaces a few weeks back, and I think we just did one a couple, maybe a week or so ago. And I'm going to kind of reiterate what we talked about on that call because we did a really great job of breaking it down. So the first thing to understand about the BSL token is that the BSL token is managed by a DAO that's registered in the state of Wyoming. And so that DAO is an LLC. And if you're familiar with the DAO structure in the United States, at least in the states that are doing it right now, the DAO structure requires that in your operating agreement, just like you would have a normal operating agreement of an LLC, that you name the smart contracts, that you name the voting mechanisms, and that you demonstrate that the operating agreement is actually, traditionally your operating agreement would be a piece of paper, everybody signs it. In the DAO format, the operating agreement is actually the smart contracts, the token, the voting site, the voting mechanisms, the online snapshots, all of that. And so when we formalized the LLC, the DAO LLC, all those things went into the formalized filing with the state of Wyoming in the form of an operating agreement that was pointing at all of those different mechanisms on chain. It wasn't a simple process because, frankly, I don't think the state had done a ton of them. And I don't think the state had done one as complex as ours. I think most of them were much, much simpler, much, much smaller, and ours was quite complex. And so, it's for as simple as it sounds, it was still more complex than anything the state had been dealing with at that point. And so after some back and forth and some understandings of exactly how the token ecosystem worked from a DAO management, not necessarily the rest of what we're going to talk about, but from the DAO management and from turning it into a legal organization and a legal entity, we worked with the state of Wyoming and we got that done. And that was about, I want to say, a year and a half, 2 years ago, roughly. And the whole purpose behind that was as we were looking at how we remain, in a state of compliance, and then how we remain in a state of, so now we're going to start talking a little bit about the lending process and the DAO and its ability to lend under that DAO LLC. That was all part of it, right? So how do you secure a lien against a asset if you don't have an entity to secure it? It can't just be a bunch of people with tokens. And so the BSL holders are all part of that DAO. Technically, they can participate in the voting. They can participate in any of the proposals that are put on chain, and then subsequently drive exactly how the token ecosystem works. And so we no longer have control of that. So after we set up the token and after we set up the DAO, we essentially gave up all of the control to the DAO token holders. And now all that Financial and BankSocial does is administer through an agreement with the DAO, is administer the will of the DAO is the best way to kind of think about that and look at that. And so that's why you see that gov.banksocial.io site. It's very similar to some of the other DAO mechanisms that came before us, but that is the mechanism by which the DAO kind of talks and discusses and formalizes and then captures, more importantly to the process of how you would operate an LLC or how you would make a binding resolution or amend an operating agreement. That all happens based on how that structure was set up at Wyoming. That all happens through the smart contract voting. And so if there's ever a question that would require, something at the state level, all that's legal in the format that we structured it under the DAO LLC.
So the token is used to invest in these assets, and that's kind of where I want to get down to. So what's that flow look like? Where does the capital come from? What kind of assets are you buying? And then how does the profits or the proceeds get back to the token holder?
Yep, absolutely. So the tokenomics of the token are that every time a token is moved around, 4% of that token is taken off the top. And the whole idea behind that was, in a lot of these DeFi lending pools, it's peer-to-peer lending. And so when you put up your tokens, you're putting up all the tokens that you lend out. And then all of those tokens are at risk. And so it doesn't really behoove somebody who's wanting to stay lower risk to get involved in a pool like that, because you're subject still to the price of Bitcoin fluctuating, and you're subject to the loss of the token under the peer-to-peer lending agreement you come up with a person. And so we wanted to do something that more so mimicked traditional finance in a bank through a smart contract mechanism, where when you put your money into a credit union or into a depository institution, your money is not technically supposed to be at risk, right? Your money is supposed to be there tomorrow when you wake up. At the same time, that money is being lent out to other third parties, right, on behalf of. And so that whole mechanism, we wanted to create a similar mechanism that could be managed through smart contracts and this DAO mechanism to offer asset-backed financing to businesses. And the reason why we chose businesses is because in the United States and most developed states or countries around the world, a lot different rules when it comes to consumer finance and business finance. Okay. So with consumer finance, you have a lot of usury laws, not that we're charging abnormal rates for these things, but you've got to be registered in states, especially in the United States. And so direct to consumer finance is a lot more heavy in the way of just management. And so much more difficult for a DAO at that point to get into something like that. Not that it couldn't do it in the future, but certainly right now. So what we do is, as that 4% comes off, it's held by the token holders, the DAO. Those funds are held by the DAO. And then as people apply for loans, the DAO has elected. So the mechanism that the DAO voted on was the delegate mechanism. So there are delegates from the community that change, and that can be kicked out or altered at any time. And those delegates have been given rules by the DAO to say, here are the rules by which you evaluate a new asset-backed loan. And then the delegates make the determination on, this is a good loan, this is a bad loan. And so what happens is as that 4% gets put into that lending pool, the DAO confirms they want to lend on a loan. That loan goes out against an asset. The asset's technically, if you want to call it, tokenized in the form of a serial number. And then that's tied to a lien in the form of a loan and an encumbrance on that asset. And then as that gets paid back, the interest off of that goes to the stakers, distributed to the stakers.
Okay, so just the flow of that. When somebody trades one of these tokens in DeFi, that 4% is going to be paid in Hbar. You also have an Ethereum version, so it might be an Ethereum.
That's
You'll have
correct.
to liquidate that. Those are the funds that are used to make the loan. Then when the loan is paid back, it's going to be converted back into one of those assets and then distributed to the token holders.
No,
Is
so
that correct?
technically what happens is that right now we're doing it in the stable coin. And that's why we came to HTS, because to do a bunch of these stake payouts on an Ethereum, for example, is impossible. And initially, frankly, we were looking at Polygon, and that was one of the reasons to go to BNB, because of the lower fees on smart contract calls. But with the HTS token, you kind of get an exponential reduction in cost over those other mechanisms. And so by having the ability to pay out in stablecoin, a portion of that would get converted back into Hbar to go back into the liquidity pool. The DAO actually sets those rules up. So there's actually a vote that happened, I think 8 or 9 months ago, that quantified how much of the returning of that lending funds would go back into the pool, how much would be paid out to the stakers, what would be converted to stable coin so that it was stable in the form of a payout, and then what would be converted back into Hbar or Ethereum as a part of that payback. So yeah, all those mechanisms are defined on both the Gov site, and then eventually turned into a solidified, call it an amendment to the operating agreement in the form of a vote on Snapshot.
All right. Now, you've already had some really big milestones. You were originally on Ethereum, as we mentioned, and the Binance Smart Chain. You've shifted from the Binance Smart Chain over to Hedera. You still have the Ethereum version. What are some of the milestones that are coming up? What can we look forward to when it comes to the BSL token in the future?
Yeah, there are tons of ecosystem enablements that are coming for the token holders in the exchange and other parts of the ecosystem. I can't go into it too much until we release it. It's kind of the better way to go about this, but there are enablements outside of just the ability to participate in these DeFi lending applications for the token holders. One of the things I think it's important to understand is that with the token, economy being what it is, there's been some discussion about should we move to Ethereum? Should we move the Ethereum over to Hbar? Should we go back over to Ethereum? The whole idea here, and I'm sure you can kind of follow this, is that getting all the tokens to Hedera ultimately gives us what we need. We can always bridge back to other chains. I'm not personally a fan of bridging because it has other implications. Certainly, though, that's an opportunity that can happen if the token holders decide that they want to bridge liquidity back over to the Ethereum side. But I think there have been a lot of questions about the whole migration entirely over to
the movement from Binance Smart Chain to Hedera makes perfect sense. Ethereum is good because there's a big pool of liquidity there. We've seen a lot of success with Karate Combat and their Karate token being able to tap into that liquidity pool, and that's exactly
bridged?
What you need.
Is it bridged, Brandon?
It's not. There's two separate tokens, but they're fairly fungible on all centralized exchanges. You can remove either one. So as long as there's some fungibility there in certain places, or by the centralized, not centralized entity, but whatever the entity is to make those fungible, I think it's just fine. And tapping into that liquidity certainly makes sense, especially for something that's going on like what you have with BSL.
And frankly, that was kind of the original justification for the two chains. It's kind of like when you look at it, a lot of people get confused if a token is launched and put on two separate centralized exchanges, it's going to have two separate prices. Doesn't matter what you do, it's going to have two separate prices. And when you look at what being on two chains or two dexes does, it's exactly the same thing. Even on Hedera, even if all the tokens were HTS tokens and we went on two different dexes, you're going to have two different prices on an ARB situation, no matter how you slice it. I'm not aware of any way to balance pricing. And that's why if you go on CoinMarket,
it has to be done through arbitrage, right?
Exactly. And so it doesn't matter. We had a lot of confusion early on. It doesn't matter if you're on two chains. The biggest thing that matters, to your point, is, are those tokens fungible, right? Does one equal another? And that's what, ultimately comes down to a problem. If it doesn't, then you don't have that's not an ARB. Then it's a complex mathematical equation that's constantly changing. And so that's really the key. I agree with you, Brandon, is, are those tokens fungible to the point that they mean exactly the same thing to the ecosystem, regardless of where they are? And that wouldn't change if the token was minted on Ethereum or bridged to Ethereum, because at one point we had people actually bridging, create their own bridge. I think that's the important thing to understand in these economies. People are always like questioning, well, why did we do the Polygon? We didn't do Polygon. Some person had a lot of tokens, decided to create a bridge, created a liquidity pool on Polygon. We can't stop that,
Sure.
Just like if somebody wanted to create another liquidity pool on the DEX now, once that token's launched, we can't really do anything. And another thing I wanted to talk about, and kind of ties into this, is we've had a lot of questions about why we have the pause key, why we have the freeze key, why we have the wipe key. And I want to address that really quick because I think it's super important. So, I'm a longtime software developer, and I've seen problems with code, and not necessarily just code, but process too, right? And one thing that happens inevitably is that you have things that would require or would need the ability for certain actions to take place to keep the economy rolling and safe. Look at the migration that we did. Had we not had the ability, had we not had the foresight and the ability to pause the token, to build the smart contract on the BNB and Ethereum side, to pause that token, a migration would have been quite difficult because, how do you remove the liquidity? How do you bridge the liquidity? How do you ensure that the token price and the token price on the other side were the same? How do you ensure that the people on the BNB side aren't getting double counted, right? Without a lot of complex code to go out and check wallets and where did it move and when did it move and when was our snapshot? And, there's so many problems that you eliminate in the ability to do this. And so that's just with the pause key, right? We know that, for example, what happens if all of a sudden, worst case scenario, one of the DEXs gets hacked? Well, by being able to implement a pause on the HTS token, we could effectively maybe not eliminate, but mitigate the ability for anybody to interact with a smart contract that's paired with our BSL token. And so, these are all mechanisms that we put in place for the DAO. Because of the DAO, we never have executed without the kind of express written consent of the DAO, any of those mechanisms. The other one that I'll talk about really quickly, which I think has turned out to be quite a savior in a lot of different scenarios, especially when you look at BNB. So BNB is full of scammers, as I'm sure you know quite well. And these fake token sites will spin up all the time, and then people will jump into Discords and on Twitter and Telegrams and post these fake sites, and then people unwittingly go click connect, wallet connect, and drain every single one of their tokens. Token Associate helps with that, but having the ability to pause and wipe and freeze and do all that, we've been able to mitigate hundreds of thousands of dollars of recovered stolen tokens. And the process of recovery involves police reports. It's quite extensive. I won't get into all of what it involves, but we've been able to successfully, without one issue, recover, I think it's somewhere in the range of almost $500,000. And that would have been more so. I mean, what are we really protecting? Are we protecting the person who got their token stolen? Not so much. We're protecting the community from getting dumped on by a scammer who just happened to convince somebody to jump onto a site, connect their wallet, right? And there's a waiting process and all this. So it's not carte blanche with the pause. There's reasoning. Certainly, does it add some risk? Yeah, it adds some risk because you have all these different keys out there, and what happens if those keys are compromised? It's just more to take into consideration. But I can tell you that everything we do, we not just take seriously the commitment to security, we test our commitment to security in the form of third-party audits, third-party scans, and not just the type of audits that you see in Web3. A lot of what you see in Web3 is just looking at on-chain activity, right? Just looking at the coding, the process. We test all of it. So, because we work in the financial institution space with credit unions, we test the entire ecosystem, all the way to penetration testing of systems, right? Where do we store the keys? How do we store the keys? How do we recover the keys? How are the keys used on smart contracts? How are they used when external calls are made to smart contracts from the wallet? So we take the security mechanisms probably paramount over everything else, just because of the nature of how DLT is kind of one and done, meaning it's very hard to reverse course when it's stamped on it's not like a database where you can just go wipe things, clear things up and recover nicely. Certainly though, thinking through those paradigms, those kind of traditional database paradigms, we can borrow a lot of what is best practice over there. There's no reason why those best practices can't evolve into best practices on DLT, because at the end of the day, I think you hear it a lot. These are kind of like new databases. And so we take that. I wanted to address the keys and the reason why. It's not because we take carte blanche. It's not because I don't think we've never said that, oh, there's a whale dumping on the community, got to go pause it. Like that's never happened in the 3 years that this token's been out here. And it's not because we don't want to do it. It's because, we respect the DAO and we respect our relationship with the DAO as an implementer of their will. And if their will is not to do those types of things, then we just don't do it. Frankly, at any point, the DAO can decide that we are not the best facilitator of their will, and they can decide to change that. So we think it's a great balance, and we think it's a really unique, novel ecosystem that we're excited about taking forward.
Well, John, all of that seems really reasonable. I know I had some confusion around everything that was going to be done with the BSL token, and I think you cleared that up all today. Thank you for coming by and explaining it all.
Thanks so much, Brandon. I appreciate it.